The rescue party found the cabin first. The roof had buckled inward under the weight of 9 feet of snow, collapsing the walls into a frozen mass of shattered logs and crushed belongings. They dug for 2 hours, expecting to recover the body of Yuri Volkov, the Russian trapper who'd built this cabin the previous spring. What they found instead was an empty bedroll, frozen supplies, and boot prints leading away from the wreckage toward the tree line. They followed the tracks through waist-deep snow, cursing the Russian for making them work harder. The tracks led to what looked like a pile of debris, branches, pine boughs, moss and snow heaped together in a rough dome shape about 6 feet tall and 8 feet wide. Smoke was rising from somewhere inside this pile. A small entrance hole, barely large enough to crawl through, faced away from the wind. "Volkov!" the rescue party leader shouted. "You in there?" A face appeared in the entrance hole, bearded, smiling, very much alive. Yuri Volkov crawled out of his debris pile, stretched, and looked at the men who'd come to rescue him from a death that hadn't happened. "You are looking for body, da?" Yuri said. "No body here, only living Russian who knows how to build proper shelter." Behind them, a frozen corpse lay half buried in snow near another collapsed cabin. Thomas Henderson, the trapper whose claim bordered Yuri's, had died 3 days earlier when his roof failed. His body had been found that morning by the same rescue party now staring at Yuri's debris pile. Henderson had been 42 years old, experienced, and had built what everyone considered a solid cabin. He'd frozen to death inside it when the structure failed. Yuri Volkov had survived in a pile of sticks that looked like something a child would build for play. The shelter everyone in Montana Territory had called the Fool's Shelter had kept him alive through the worst blizzard in 20 years, while proper cabins collapsed and killed the men inside them. Yuri Volkov was 47 years old when he arrived in Montana Territory in the spring of 1886. He'd emigrated from Siberia, not the relatively mild southern regions, but the brutal northeast where winter temperatures dropped to 60 below and lasted 8 months. He'd spent his youth as a hunter and trapper in conditions that made Montana seem almost tropical. In Siberia, Yuri had learned that survival wasn't about building the strongest structure or the most impressive shelter. Survival was about building what worked when everything else failed. The Evenki and Yakut peoples of his homeland had taught him techniques that seemed primitive to outsiders, but had kept people alive for thousands of years in the coldest inhabited places on Earth. When Yuri filed his trapping claim near Fort Benton and began preparing for his first Montana winter, he did something that baffled and amused his neighbors. He built a cabin, a proper log cabin that satisfied the requirements of his claim, but he also built something else. Behind his cabin, in a sheltered spot between 2 large pines, he constructed what he called a balagan, a debris shelter made from branches, pine boughs, moss, bark, and whatever other materials he could gather. The balagan was small, just large enough for one man to lie down inside. It was dome-shaped, with walls about 2 feet thick made of layered debris. The entrance was a small tunnel that required crawling to enter. From the outside, it looked like a random pile of forest debris, indistinguishable from the natural deadfall scattered throughout the woods. Thomas Henderson, whose claim was a quarter-mile east, rode over in September to see what Yuri was building. He found the Russian carefully layering pine boughs over a framework of bent saplings, creating what looked like a giant bird's nest. "What in God's name is that?" Henderson asked. "Is balagan, emergency shelter. If cabin fails, I sleep here." "Your cabin's not going to fail? I watched you build it. Solid construction. All cabins can fail. Roof collapse, fire, many things. This shelter cannot fail. Has no roof to collapse. Cannot burn when covered with snow. Needs no maintenance." Henderson laughed. "That pile of sticks is your backup plan? A bird could build a better shelter. Bird survives winter every year. How many trappers survive every winter?" "Fair point, but that thing looks ridiculous. The other men are already calling it the Fool's Shelter. Let them call it what they want. When I'm alive in spring, and they are not, we see who is fool." Henderson rode away, still laughing. The story spread through the trapping community. The crazy Russian had built a brush pile behind his cabin and called it emergency shelter. He'd spent 2 weeks gathering debris and stacking it like a beaver dam, while other men were doing real work, cutting firewood, setting trap lines, preparing for profitable trapping. Yuri Volkov was clearly touched in the head, wasting time on what everyone agreed was the most foolish construction project anyone had seen. They called it the Fool's Shelter, and the name stuck. Yuri's balagan wasn't actually foolish at all. It was engineered for survival using principles refined over centuries of Siberian experience. The construction process was specific and deliberate. The framework, Yuri started by cutting flexible saplings, each about 2 inches in diameter and 8 to 10 feet long. He bent these saplings into arches, sticking both ends into the ground to create a dome-shaped framework about 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall at the center. He wove smaller branches horizontally through the arches, creating a lattice that would hold the insulating materials. The base layer. Over the framework, Yuri laid large pieces of bark stripped from dead birch and pine trees. This bark layer served as a moisture barrier, preventing melting snow from dripping into the interior. He overlapped the bark pieces like shingles, working from bottom to top so water would run off rather than seep through. The insulation layers. On top of the bark, Yuri piled pine boughs, hundreds of them, layered with the needles pointing downward so they'd shed water. The pine bough layer was about 8 inches thick. Over the pine boughs, he added dried leaves, moss, and forest debris, another 12 inches of material that would trap dead air and provide insulation. The outer shell, the final layer, was a thick covering of additional branches, sticks, and brush, packed down and interwoven to hold everything in place. This outer layer added structure and prevented wind from penetrating the inner insulation. When complete, the walls were approximately 24 inches thick, 2 feet of layered natural materials with excellent insulating properties. The entrance tunnel was deliberately small, just large enough to crawl through on hands and knees. It was positioned to face away from prevailing winds and angled slightly upward so cold air would tend to flow out rather than in. A bundle of pine boughs served as a removable door that could seal the entrance when needed. The interior. Inside the dome, Yuri excavated slightly into the ground, creating a depression about 6 inches deep that would collect any water that seeped in. The sleeping area was raised slightly on a platform of logs covered with more pine boughs, keeping the occupant off the cold ground. The interior space was small, just enough room to lie down and sit up, but this was intentional. A small space required less body heat to warm. The fire pit. At the entrance to the shelter, just inside the tunnel, Yuri created a small fire pit lined with stones. This position allowed a small fire to provide warmth while keeping smoke from filling the interior. The fire didn't need to be inside the shelter. It only needed to warm the air entering through the tunnel. The total construction time was about 2 weeks of part-time work, gathering materials during trapline checks, building in spare hours. The materials cost nothing. When finished, the shelter looked like a natural debris pile, nearly invisible unless you knew what to look for. Henderson and the other trappers thought it was a waste of time. A real man built a real cabin and maintained a real fire. This brush pile was primitive, undignified, and pointless. The autumn trapping season proceeded normally. Yuri worked his trap lines, prepared his pelts, and stored supplies for winter. He also continued improving his balagan, adding more insulation layers as materials became available, reinforcing the framework, and testing the shelter during cold nights. In late October, he spent a night in the balagan as a test. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees, cold but not extreme. Without any fire, the shelter interior stayed at approximately 42 degrees. When Yuri lit a small fire in the entrance pit, interior temperature rose to 55 degrees. His body, heat alone could raise it another 5 to 8 degrees. The shelter worked exactly as expected. He invited Henderson to see the test results. Henderson crawled into the shelter reluctantly, stayed for about 30 seconds, and crawled back out. "It's warmer than I expected," Henderson admitted, "but it's still a hole in the ground covered with sticks. My cabin is 65 degrees right now with a proper fire." And if your fire goes out, if your chimney clogs, if your roof collapses, none of those things are going to happen. They happen to someone every winter. This year, maybe you, maybe me, maybe someone else, but someone's cabin will fail. When it does, will they have backup? I've got a good cabin. I don't need backup. Then I hope your cabin is as good as you believe. The mocking continued through November. Other trappers would detour past Yuri's claim specifically to see the fool's shelter, laughing at the brush pile, making jokes about the crazy Russian who slept in a bird's nest. Yuri ignored them all. He knew what Montana winter could bring. He'd survived worse in Siberia. These Americans, with their confidence in log cabins and their ignorance of extreme conditions, would learn eventually. He just hoped the lesson wouldn't be fatal. December brought the first serious cold. Temperature dropped to 20 below for several nights. The trappers hunkered down in their cabins, burning wood steadily, waiting for the worst to pass. Yuri's cabin held heat well. He'd built it properly, despite what his neighbors thought of his backup shelter. But he checked his balagan regularly, ensuring it remained ready for use. He noticed something concerning in mid-December. The snow load on his cabin roof was accumulating faster than expected. The roof structure was adequate for normal snowfall, but a particularly heavy winter could stress it beyond capacity. He cleared the roof twice that month, something most trappers didn't bother doing. Henderson didn't clear his roof at all. Never had to before, he said when Yuri suggested it. Roofs strong enough. The storm that would kill Thomas Henderson and 3 other trappers in the Montana Territory began on January 14, 1887. It didn't start dramatically, just steady snow, moderate wind, nothing that seemed unusual for midwinter. But it didn't stop. By January 16th, 3 feet of new snow had accumulated. By January 18th, 5 feet. By January 20th, the total snowpack exceeded 9 feet, and the storm was still intensifying. Wind increased to 50 miles per hour, creating drifts that buried some structures completely. Temperature dropped to 35 below zero. Yuri's cabin roof began groaning on January 19th. He could hear the ridge poles straining under the weight, could see the ceiling bowing inward. He cleared the roof once, but the snow was falling so fast that his efforts barely made a difference. Within hours, the accumulation had returned. On January 20th, at approximately 2 in the morning, Yuri's cabin roof collapsed. He was awake when it happened. The groaning had kept him alert, ready to move. When the first crack sounded, he grabbed his emergency pack and dove through the door, rolling away from the structure as tons of logs and snow crashed down. The cabin that had taken him 3 months to build was destroyed in seconds. He was outside in 35 below weather, in the middle of a blizzard, in his sleeping clothes, with only the emergency pack he'd kept ready by the door. Any other trapper in the territory would have been in serious trouble, possibly dead within hours. Yuri walked 30 yards through waist-deep snow to his fool's shelter. He crawled through the entrance tunnel, pulled his pine bough door closed behind him, and found himself in a space that was cold but not deadly, perhaps 20 degrees, insulated from the wind and snow that raged outside. He unpacked his emergency kit: flint and steel, tinder, candles, dried meat, a small pot, and a compact bedroll he'd prepared specifically for this possibility. He lit a small fire in the entrance pit using materials he'd pre-positioned there months earlier. Within an hour, the interior temperature had risen to 50 degrees. He ate some dried meat, drank melted snow, and went to sleep on the pine bough platform. The storm raged outside. Inside the fool's shelter, Yuri was warm, dry, and safe. He stayed in the balagan for 6 days. During those 6 days, Yuri experienced firsthand what made the balagan superior to cabin construction in extreme conditions. Snow load. Unlike a cabin with a rigid roof that could collapse under excessive weight, the balagan was a dome of flexible materials that simply compressed as snow accumulated. The snow didn't damage the structure. It improved it, adding insulation. By the 3rd day, the shelter was buried under additional feet of snow, but this only made it warmer and more stable. Wind protection. The dome shape and debris construction created a windproof barrier. Even with 50-mile-per-hour winds outside, The interior was dead calm. No drafts penetrated the 2-foot-thick walls of layered debris. Thermal performance. The small interior space, combined with Yuri's body heat and occasional small fires, maintained temperature between 45 and 60 degrees throughout his stay. This was cold by cabin standards, but easily survivable with proper bedding. More importantly, it was consistent. No wild temperature swings when fires died down. Fuel efficiency. Yuri's small entrance fires consumed perhaps 5 pounds of wood per day, a fraction of what a cabin fireplace would require. He had enough pre-positioned fuel to last 2 weeks if necessary. Psychological comfort. Despite its primitive appearance, the balagan felt secure. The close walls, the soft pine bough flooring, the dim filtered light, all combined to create a cocoon-like environment that was actually comfortable in its own way. On the 4th day, during a brief break in the storm, Yuri ventured outside to check conditions. The landscape was transformed. Snow drifts rose 15 feet high in some places. Familiar landmarks were buried or reshaped, and his collapsed cabin was completely invisible under the white blanket. He tried to reach Henderson's cabin a quarter-mile away, but couldn't make progress through the deep snow without snowshoes. He returned to his shelter and waited. On January 26th, the storm finally broke. Temperature rose slightly, wind dropped, and the first rescue parties began venturing out from Fort Benton to check on isolated trappers. The rescue party found Henderson first. His cabin had collapsed on January 20th, the same day as Yuri's, but Henderson had no backup shelter. He'd been trapped under debris, injured but alive, unable to escape. He'd frozen to death sometime in the following 48 hours, his body found partially buried in the wreckage of his proper cabin. 2 other trappers in the region had died similarly: roof collapses during the storm, no backup shelter, death by exposure. A 4th had died trying to travel to a neighbor's cabin after his own failed, found frozen in a snowdrift halfway between the 2 structures. 4 dead, all experienced trappers, all in log cabins that had been adequate for every previous winter, but insufficient for the extreme snow load of January 1887. And then there was Yuri, crawling out of his brush pile, alive and relatively comfortable after 6 days in what everyone had called the Fool's Shelter. The rescue party leader, a man named John Mitchell, stared at the debris dome with new eyes. "This kept you alive? Da is balagan, Siberian design, cannot collapse from snow. Snow makes it stronger, cannot fail because nothing can fail, is just pile of debris shaped like shelter." Henderson's cabin looked a lot more solid than this. Henderson's cabin is pile of logs now. This pile of sticks is still shelter. Which is better? Mitchell walked around the balagan, examining the construction. He could see now what he'd missed before: the careful layering, the intentional dome shape, the angled entrance. It wasn't a random pile of debris. It was engineered shelter disguised as debris. "Why didn't you tell people this could save their lives?" "I did tell them. They laughed, called it Fool's Shelter. Said I was crazy Russian who sleeps in bird nests. Now Henderson is dead, and I am alive. Maybe now people will listen." Mitchell was quiet for a moment. "Will you teach others how to build these?" "We'll teach anyone who wants to learn. His simple technique. Takes maybe 3 days to build. Uses materials that are everywhere. Anyone can do it. Even if their cabin doesn't collapse, they'd have somewhere to go if it burns, or if they get caught away from camp." "Da, exactly. Is not replacement for cabin, is backup, insurance, something that will work when everything else fails." Over the following weeks, Yuri taught the balagan construction technique to every trapper willing to learn. The mockery had stopped. 4 deaths had a way of ending jokes. Men who'd called him crazy were now asking for detailed instructions. The technique was straightforward but specific. Site selection. Choose a spot protected from prevailing winds, ideally between trees or rocks that provide additional shelter. Slight slope helps with drainage. Avoid areas where water might pool during snowmelt. Framework construction. Cut 8 to 12 flexible saplings, each about 2 inches diameter and 10 feet long, bend into arches, creating a dome approximately 6 feet wide at the base and 4 feet tall at the center. Weave smaller branches horizontally to create a lattice base layer. Cover the framework with overlapping bark pieces, working from bottom to top like shingles. This creates a moisture barrier. Insulation layers. Add pine boughs, needles down, 8 to 12 inches thick. Add dried leaves, moss, and forest debris, another 12 inches thick. Total insulation should be 18 to 24 inches minimum. Outer shell. Cover with additional branches and brush, interwoven for stability. This protects the insulation from wind and add structure. Entrance tunnel. Create a small entrance, just large enough to crawl through, facing away from prevailing wind. The tunnel should angle slightly upward to prevent cold air from flowing in. Create a removable door from bundled pine boughs. Interior. Excavate slightly for drainage. Build a raised sleeping platform from logs covered with pine boughs. Create a small fire pit at the entrance inside the tunnel, lined with stones. Pre-position. Stock the shelter with emergency supplies, fire-starting materials, dried food, candles, bedding. Check and refresh these supplies periodically. By the end of February 1887, 11 Balagan shelters had been built throughout the Fort Benton trapping area. Some were backup shelters behind cabins, like Yuri's original. Others were positioned along trap lines as emergency refugees for men caught in bad weather away from home. A few trappers, having lost confidence in cabin construction entirely, built balagans as their primary winter shelter. The results were measurable. The following winter, 1887-88, was less severe than the one that had killed Henderson and the others, but several situations arose where trappers used their balagan shelters. A cabin fire in November, a lost trapper in December, a partial roof collapse in January. In every case, the backup shelter worked as designed, and men who might have died survived because they had somewhere to go when their primary shelter failed. Modern survival science explains why Yuri's balagan worked so effectively. Insulation value. Layered debris has an R value, thermal resistance, of approximately R1 per inch. 24 inches of debris provides R24 insulation comparable to a well-insulated modern home wall. The key is the trapped air. Debris creates millions of tiny air pockets that dramatically reduce heat transfer. Dome geometry. A dome shape is structurally optimal for resisting external pressure. Weight pushes inward and downward equally, distributing stress. Unlike flat roofs that can fail catastrophically under snow load, domes simply compress, becoming denser and stronger as weight increases. Flexibility. Rigid structures fail when stress exceeds their breaking point. Flexible structures deform under stress without breaking. The balagan's framework of bent saplings could flex and shift without structural failure, accommodating snow loads that would collapse rigid log construction. Wind resistance. The irregular surface of debris breaks up wind flow, preventing the direct pressure that can damage or destroy flat-walled structures. Wind slides over and around the dome rather than pushing against it. Thermal mass. The debris walls, once warmed by body heat or small fires, retain that warmth for extended periods. The small interior volume means minimal heat is needed to maintain comfortable temperature. Snow integration. Perhaps most importantly, the balagan improved with snow coverage. Snow is itself an excellent insulator, R1 per inch. When a balagan becomes buried in snow, it gains additional insulation rather than suffering structural damage. Yuri's shelter, buried under several feet of snow during the storm, was warmer and more stable than it had been before the snow fell. The physics were simple. Solid materials transfer heat and stress. Trapped air insulates and cushions. Flexible structures survive what rigid structures cannot. The balagan used all these principles simultaneously. What set Yuri apart from other trappers shelters wasn't just his knowledge of Balagan construction, it was his entire approach to survival. He explained his philosophy to Mitchell during one of their conversations. In Siberia, we say, a man with one shelter has none, meaning one shelter can always fail. Fire, collapse, flood, many ways to lose shelter. But two shelters, much harder to lose both. Three shelters, almost impossible. American trappers put all confidence in cabin, build good cabin, think work is done, but cabin is single point of failure. If cabin fails, man dies, is terrible strategy. I build cabin because cabin is comfortable, because cabin satisfies claim requirements, because cabin is what people expect. But I never trust cabin completely. I always have backup. If cabin fails, I have Balagan. If Balagan somehow fails, I can build snow shelter, debris shelter, find natural cave, many options, always have next option prepared. Men who died in storm, Henderson, others, they had no next option. Cabin was everything. When cabin became nothing, they became nothing too. Is not about building strongest shelter. Strongest shelter can still fail. Is about building system where no single failure is fatal. Redundancy, backup, options. This is how you survive not one winter but many winters. Mitchell listened carefully. Most men would say that's too much work. Building two shelters when one should be enough. Is more work, but is also more life. How much work is your life worth? Henderson saved maybe 2 weeks of labor by not building backup shelter. Now he is dead. 2 weeks of labor for entire remaining lifetime. Good trade, I think. When you put it that way, most men don't put it that way. Most men think, my cabin is strong, nothing will happen. This is not thinking. This is hoping. Hoping is not strategy. Strategy is preparing for what might happen, not just what should happen. Yuri Volkov continued trapping in Montana Territory until 1893, when he was 54 years old. He survived 7 more winters without serious incident, though he rebuilt his cabin twice and used his Balagan shelters on 3 occasions when conditions made his cabin uncomfortable or unsafe. The Balagan technique spread throughout the northern trapping communities. By 1890, debris backup shelters were common enough that they no longer drew comment. They were simply part of competent winter preparation. Old-timers would tell newcomers, first you build your cabin, then you build your Balagan. In that order, always. The January 1887 storm remained a reference point for decades. When someone questioned the necessity of backup shelters, old-timers would invoke the names Henderson, Morrison, Williams, Taylor, the men who died because they had no second option. And they'd mention Yuri Volkov, the Russian with the fool's shelter, who'd survived 6 days in a brush pile, while better men froze in proper cabins. The U.S. Army adopted debris shelter construction as part of its cold weather survival training in the 1920s. The techniques taught were nearly identical to what Yuri had built in 1886. Dome frameworks, layered insulation, small entrances, minimal interior space. The Army called them debris huts and considered them essential survival knowledge. Modern wilderness survival courses teach the same principles. The terminology has changed. Debris shelter or leaf hut instead of Balagan, but the physics remain identical. Trapped air insulates, dome shapes distribute load, flexible structures survive, small spaces require less heating, backup plans save lives. The fool's shelter wasn't foolish at all. It was ancient wisdom disguised as primitive construction, refined through centuries of survival in the harshest conditions on Earth, dismissed by men who couldn't see past its humble appearance. Yuri Volkov understood something that Thomas Henderson never learned. The measure of a shelter isn't how impressive it looks or how comfortable it feels on a normal day. The measure of a shelter is whether it keeps you alive when everything goes wrong. Henderson's cabin looked better, felt better, cost more to build. It was a proper structure that any man would be proud of, and it killed him when the snow load exceeded what proper construction could handle. Yuri's balagan looked like a pile of sticks. Other trappers laughed at it, mocked it, called it the fool's shelter. It was primitive, uncomfortable, undignified, and it kept him alive for 6 days in conditions that killed 4 men in proper cabins. The fool wasn't the man who built the backup shelter. The fool was the man who thought he didn't need one. Yuri Volkov died in 1909 at age 70 in a small house in Helena, Montana. His obituary in the Helena Independent noted that he'd been a trapper for many years and had survived conditions that claimed many lesser men. It didn't mention the balagan or the fool's shelter, but the technique survived. It passed from Yuri to the trappers he taught, from those trappers to the next generation, from the frontier to the military to modern survival schools. Today, anyone who takes a wilderness survival course learns some version of the same construction. Framework of saplings, layers of debris, dome shape, small entrance, minimal interior. Somewhere in the Montana mountains, the site where Yuri's original balagan stood has returned to forest. The saplings that form the framework rotted away decades ago. The pine boughs and debris have long since decomposed into soil. There's no marker, no memorial, no indication that anything significant ever happened there. But every debris shelter built since then carries the same DNA, the same physics, the same principles, the same understanding that sometimes primitive is just another word for proven. Everyone mocked the fool's shelter. They called it ridiculous, called it primitive, called it the kind of thing only a crazy Russian would waste time building. They knew that proper men built proper cabins and trusted those cabins to keep them alive. Then winter came, and the proper cabins collapsed, and the proper men froze, and the crazy Russian crawled out of his brush pile, alive and warm, having outsmarted winter with the simplest possible shelter, a pile of sticks that looked like nothing and saved everything. Sometimes the fool's way is the only way that works.